It was just another Monday morning at Greenridge High, where students shuffled to the corridors, their backpacks slung lazily over their shoulders, the murmurs of morning conversations blending into the sound of squeaky sneakers against the polished floors. Among them was Lena Carter, a quiet but bright girl who mostly kept to herself. She wasn't one for attention, and she preferred the solitude of her books to the noise of her peers. As she entered Mr. Reynolds' English class, she kept her gaze low, clutching a well-worn notebook to her chest. Today was presentation day, a nightmare for someone like her. The students had been assigned a poetry recitation, a task that should have been simple, but for Lena, it was anything but. Mr. Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a sharp tongue and little patience for mistakes, clapped his hands together as he stood at the front of the class. His piercing eyes scanned the room. All right, let's get this over with. Who's next? Silence. Lena felt a knot form in her stomach. She prayed he wouldn't call on her, but fate was rarely kind. Lena Carter, he announced, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Come up and show us what you've got. Lena swallowed hard. Her hands trembled as she stood, gripping the notebook like a lifeline. She made her way to the front, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She could feel the stares of her classmates, their hushed giggles already brewing. She took a deep breath and opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. A few chuckles erupted from the back of the room. Mr. Reynolds folded his arms, tilting his head. Well, we're waiting. Lena's throat tightened. The letters on the page blurred together. Her mind was blank, locked in a paralyzing haze. The teacher sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes. Unbelievable. You mean to tell me that after a whole week of preparation, you can't even get a single word out? His voice dripped with condescension. The class erupted in laughter. Lena's cheeks burned as tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to force the words out, but all she managed was a stammer. Mr. Reynolds scoffed. Looks like someone didn't do their homework. More laughter. Lena wanted to disappear, her hands clenched around the paper, her nails digging into the pages. Then Mr. Reynolds delivered the final blow. This, he gestured to her, is a prime example of why some students simply don't belong in advanced classes. The room fell silent. Even the students who had been laughing shifted uncomfortably. The weight of his words settled in the air, suffocating. Lena's vision blurred as she turned and ran out of the classroom, the sound of muffled whispers trailing behind her. But what no one knew, what even she didn't realize, was that this moment was about to change everything. Lena ran down the hallway, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Her vision was blurred, not just from the tears stinging her eyes, but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. Mr. Reynolds' words echoed in her mind. Some students simply don't belong in advanced classes. She burst into the girls' restroom and locked herself inside a stall. Clutching a notebook to her chest, she took slow, deep breaths, trying to steady herself. She had always known she wasn't the most outspoken student, but was she really as useless as Mr. Reynolds made her feel? A knock on the stall door startled her. Lena? It was Emma, her only real friend at Greenridge High. Unlike Lena, Emma was confident, outspoken, and never afraid to challenge authority. Hey, it's okay, Emma said softly. I saw what happened. Mr. Reynolds was way out of line. Lena wiped her eyes and hesitated before opening the door. Emma's expression was one of pure concern. You didn't deserve that, Emma continued. And you know it. Lena shook her head. Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't belong in advanced classes. Emma narrowed her eyes. That's nonsense. You love poetry. I've read your stuff. It's incredible. The problem isn't you, it's him. He wanted to humiliate you. Lena bit her lip, looking down at her notebook. Inside it were poems she had never shown anyone except Emma. They were raw, emotional, real. Emma's eyes lit up with an idea. Lena, what if you don't need to speak? What if you let your words do the talking in another way? Lena frowned. What do you mean? Emma grinned. Submit one of your poems to the statewide Young Writers Competition. It's coming up next month, right? You could prove to everyone, including yourself, that your writing belongs exactly where it is. Lena hesitated. The thought of exposing her words to strangers, of being judged all over again, terrified her. But at the same time, deep inside, something flickered. A tiny spark that had been buried under years of self-doubt. What if I lose? Lena whispered. Emma shrugged. Then you lose. But at least you proved to yourself that you tried. And that's more than what Reynolds expects of you. Lena looked at her notebook once more, her fingers tracing the inked words on the page. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe she wasn't meant to stand in front of a classroom and recite words out loud. But that didn't mean her voice didn't matter. And suddenly, for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than fear. She felt determined. Over the next few days, Lena poured her heart into writing. Every moment she wasn't in class. She was in the library, her notebook open, filling its pages with words she had never dared to speak aloud. She had chosen a poem she had written months ago, but never had the courage to share. It was called Unheard, a deeply personal piece about being overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. Emma sat across from her in the library, tapping her pencil against her notebook. I still think you should read it out loud before submitting it. Lena shook her head. I can't. The words are meant to be read, not spoken. Emma sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she helped Lena type the poem into the submission form for the statewide Young Writers Competition. With a deep breath, Lena clicked submit. There, Emma said, grinning. Now we wait. Mr. Reynolds hadn't let up on Lena. If anything, his comments had become sharper. When she turned in her next essay, he barely glanced at it before handing it back with a red mark at the top. C-. This is what happens when students don't push themselves, he muttered loud enough for class to hear. Mediocre work produces mediocre results. Lena clenched her fists under the desk. She had poured hours into that essay. Emma shot her a look that said, Ignore him. You'll prove him wrong soon. But Lena wasn't sure. Doubt began creeping back in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if her poem didn't make it past the first round? That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Maybe Mr. Reynolds was right. Maybe she was just mediocre. But the next morning, everything changed. Lena had just sat down for breakfast when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. Congratulations! Your poem has been selected as a finalist in the statewide Young Writers Competition. She blinked, reread the words. Then again, her heart pounded. Finalist? She gasped, nearly dropping her phone. Emma, she whispered. Then louder, Emma? Emma, who was still half asleep on the couch, bolted upright. What happened? Lena shoved the phone toward her. Emma's eyes widened as she read the email. Lena, she breathed, a huge grin spreading across her face. You did it. Lena couldn't believe it. For the first time, her words had been heard. But the real test was still ahead, because finalists were invited to an award ceremony, where the winner would be announced in front of an audience, and finalists were expected to read their work out loud. Lena's stomach dropped. She had just faced one fear, but now a bigger one was waiting. Lena sat frozen, staring at the email. The words blurred together as her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She had spent her whole life trying to stay invisible. Now, she was being asked to do the one thing that terrified her the most, stand on a stage and speak. Emma, however, was ecstatic. Lena, this is amazing. You're going to read your poem in front of everyone. Lena's stomach twisted. That's the problem. Emma's smile faltered. Oh. Lena put her phone down and took a shaky breath. I can't do it. I can't stand in front of a crowd and... You can, Emma interrupted gently. You should. This is your moment. But all Lena could think about was Mr. Reynolds, his smirks, his insults, his constant reminders that she was never good enough. What if she got on stage and froze? What if she messed up? What if... I can't, she whispered. Emma studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, she grabbed Lena's notebook and flipped to a blank page. She wrote something down and slid the notebook back across the table. Lena looked down at the words. Fear is loud, but your voice is louder. She swallowed hard. As the award ceremony drew closer, Lena's anxiety only grew. She spent hours practicing in front of a mirror, but couldn't get through a single stanza without stumbling. One evening, Emma surprised her with a makeshift audience, her parents, her younger brother, and even a few of their classmates from school. Lena's palms were sweaty as she stood before them. "I can't." Emma raised an eyebrow. "The stage is going to be much bigger than this." Lena's cheeks burned, but she nodded. She took a deep breath, looked at the notebook in her hands, and began to read. Her voice was shaky at first, barely above a whisper. But as she went on, something shifted. The words weren't just words anymore. They were her story. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, her audience started clapping. Lena blinked. "You did it," Emma said, beaming. Lena's lips parted in shock. "I did." For the first time, a spark of confidence lit up inside her. Maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than her fear. The next morning at school, Mr. Reynolds was handing back assignments. As usual, he barely glanced at Lena before dropping her graded paper on her desk. But Lena wasn't thinking about his validation anymore. She had her validation. Then, just as the bell rang, something unexpected happened. One of the senior students stood in the doorway, holding a flyer. "Hey, are you Lena?" Lena hesitated. Yeah." The student grinned and held up the flyer. It was a promotional poster for the writing competition, and Lena's name was on it. "Whoa!" Another student whispered. "She's a finalist?" A murmur rippled through the classroom. Even Mr. Reynolds had gone strangely quiet. For the first time ever, all eyes were on Lena, but not with judgment, with respect. And Mr. Reynolds? He was staring at her, speechless. For the first time, she had left him with no words. The night of the competition arrived faster than Lena had expected. She stood backstage, gripping her notebook so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sound of the audience, murmurs, footsteps, and occasional bursts of laughter felt deafening. She peeked through the curtain. The auditorium was packed. Students, parents, teachers. Even Mr. Reynolds sat in the crowd, arms crossed, watching the stage with his usual cold expression. Her stomach twisted. What if she made a fool of herself? What if her voice cracked? What if... Emma touched her shoulder. "Lena, breathe." Lena exhaled shakily. "You wrote this because it means something. It's time to share it." Before she could let fear take over, Lena heard her name over the speakers. "Next, we have a finalist from Westwood High, Lena Carter." A round of applause followed. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. For a brief moment, her mind went blank. But then, she looked at the first line of her poem. The words she had written when she felt invisible. The words that had poured out of her heart when no one had believed in her. And suddenly, the fear didn't feel so big anymore. She began to read. At first, her voice was soft. But as she spoke, the words became stronger, more alive. Her poem spoke of a girl who had been told she wasn't enough. A girl who had been silenced by doubt and fear. A girl who had been humiliated by those who thought they knew her limits. But in the end, the girl found her voice. And when Lena finished the final line, the room was silent. Then applause erupted, not just polite claps. Thunderous applause, cheers, even a standing ovation. Lena's eyes widened. She had never experienced anything like this. She scanned the crowd and stopped when she saw Mr. Reynolds. For the first time, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't scoffing. He looked stunned, and for the first time, she didn't care what he thought. After the competition, people came up to her, students, teachers, even strangers, congratulating her. "You were incredible. Your words hit me so hard. I wish I had your courage when I was younger." Lena barely knew how to respond. She had never been seen like this before. Then she turned to see Mr. Reynolds walking toward her. For a moment, she expected him to say something cruel, to downplay her success. Instead, he hesitated. His jaw tightened. And then in a stiff voice, he said, "Good work." It wasn't much, but coming from him, it was everything. Lena watched as he walked away. She smiled, because for the first time in her life, she knew his opinion didn't define her anymore. She had defined herself. And nothing could take that away.